it seems like everything I read today related to drones and how high they fly. How about this first one? It says, see a National Geographic team survey Everest with a drone at 28,300 feet. Mount Everest has been the site of both disasters and triumphs as climbers have attempted to reach the summit of the treacherous and icy mountain. National Geographic's upcoming documentary, Lost on Everest, follows the trail of the infamous 1924 expedition of George Leigh Mallory and Andrew Sandy Irvine. And as I said, they basically use a drone to see all the views of that height. And it says here, the clip shows how drone flights were used to survey the dangerous Everest terrain without having to risk climbers. The team was able to capture both sweeping landscape views and close-in photographs of key areas of the mountain. This was no ordinary drone flight. The drone soared to 28,300 feet. The summit of Everest is just over 29,000 feet. That got me thinking, because by the looks of it, it was just a regular DJI consumer drone. There's like a ceiling on those things, isn't it? Like 500 meters? So was this 28,300 feet from, say, the ground level, like way below? Or did they actually hike up there and then fly 500 meters from wherever they were? It makes me think too, in this case, with people using it in these ways, in these areas, are people going to freak out and say you could have killed someone by flying that high, for example? Or no, basically it's a good tool to use to document things like here and for research. With that in mind, it was kind of interesting reading this because, as you guys know, I talked about how in Canada they're thinking of changing things like the beyond visual line of sight rules for flying things like drones, where in certain circumstances, for example, like you have a follow me of a drone like so low, I mean, that's a little ludicrous to say you need all these waivers and stuff like that to do that. Whereas there are organizations saying they don't want, I guess, this to be too light or lax, or in some ways they don't even agree with it at all. So this was by the Canadian Owners and Pilots Association, and based on their report, they're saying, nope, we don't like this. Some of the quotes you just made me think of that point again, where it's traditional manned aviation pilot versus modern day drone flyer. Completely different perspectives in terms of how you actually use things like the tech, especially if you're like a pilot with very little to no drone experience, in my opinion. This one says, COPA responds to TC proposal to loosen drone rules. Transport Canada is proposing to permit beyond visual line of sight operations for certain classes of RPAS, remotely piloted aircraft systems, or as most people know as drones, deemed to be a lower risk. You guys can watch my previous video if you want really detailed information about what it was all about and what it could mean. But here they say, much of the push for regulatory change has come from industry, especially in the heavier RPAS categories. However, recreation RPAS users, as well as commercial users who fall into the 250 grams to 25 kilogram range of RPAS, have also been complaining that the existing regulations, considered to be many among the most restrictive among developed nations, do not take into advances in drone technology. COPA is taking a position against the proposed amendments on safety grounds. Appended below are a copy of the NPA and a copy of the letter from COPA's president and CEO, Bernard Gervais, to the Canadian Aviation Regulation Advisory Council. So that's where all the interesting stuff comes from, and just from reading some of their text, for example, it says, COPA has reviewed the subject document in detail and assessed all aspects of this NPA form and the perspective of its impact on aviation, most particularly on general aviation. COPA considers this NPA will introduce a very significant threat to all aspects of aviation flight safety in the whole of Canadian airspace, as we are profoundly for the development and growth of RPAS and safe integration within our airspace. COPA is strongly opposed to this NPA. I guess the first thing is, that was my point before. It's always your airspace is going into your territory. I would argue it's the other way around if you're talking about recreational users, like the majority, for example, like even people that fly model aircrafts. In my opinion, if you're trying to govern things below here, like on the ground level or closer to the ground level, in my opinion, you are the ones coming into here. If you're saying like a drone guy is going all the way up like 2,000 feet or something like that in your flight path, then that's completely different. Not when you're this low around trees and stuff. I mean, we got bigger issues if pilots are actually flying around here with trees and buildings and stuff like that this low. And they seem to continue with the point again, where in their mind, a drone operator should be governed almost like the same thing as a regular manned aircraft person. It says the NPAA calls this structure the 3 Ps, pilot, product, and procedures. Sadly enough, the similarity between the aviation structure and the RPAS structure ends here, where the aviation environment is very well defined, highly regulated, and constantly monitored by TCCA. At the expense of the user, the RPAS environment imposes very little in these regards. COPA believes that RPAS technology has reached a level where it can and should be deployed toward greater efficiency and enjoyment of our overall lives, in similar fashion as the aircraft has achieved such until now. But deployment of the RPAS technology to achieve this worthy goal does not justify doing so without due regard to flight safety and due consideration to our current level of this in this regards. So here in Canada, we have this system where if you want to fly like a drone in controlled airspace, it has to be declared by the manufacturer that it's safe to operate like in those ways and circumstances, or even like flying over people. And then if you want detailed, let's say approval, like you want to fly, I don't know, 1,000 feet in the air, then you have to go through this SFOC process. And in my opinion, a lot of this stuff is based on manned aviation, which even I would say in many cases, it doesn't make sense. It's not the same thing. And funny enough, they kind of have, I guess, a different view of this where it doesn't make sense, where people aren't restricted even more, I guess you could say, like with a drone operator. So here they say, TCCA recognizes that GERIS SORA relies heavily on kinetic energy for assessing the risk of the operation, yet chooses to maintain an approach based on the weight, actually the mass, of the RPA, acknowledging that this approach would make it easier for the manufacturers and industry to achieve compliance. Here's an interesting quote here. It says, "It would appear as though TCCA is more focused on being nice to RPAS manufacturers and industry than ensuring our level of flight safety is maintained. The additional argument that using the mass of the RPAS instead of kinetic energy will provide alignment with the framework in place in the CARS for aircraft with a pilot on board might be accurate, but is of dubious value. The major difference in this equation is that the aircraft has a pilot on board who quite likely understands the consequences of his or her actions on the preservation of one's own life, while the RPAS pilot will typically be kilometers away, blind to the actual air traffic environment, totally lacking situational awareness, yet safely on the ground, and will always have the prerogative of being sorry and then flying again after the accident. Not really supportive of flight safety." Seriously? Did you just say that in such a stereotypical and prejudiced way? You're basically categorizing everyone that flies like a drone where, oh, if we crash a drone, we're gonna fly that high, oh, who cares? Like, the punishment's not gonna be there, we're just gonna do it again. Do you realize how for a lot of people, when they fly in those ways, they're really adamant about not wanting to crash? I mean, for one, they don't want to lose $1,000 of equipment. I mean, that is completely prejudice, in my opinion, to say, oh, an aircraft pilot, they care about safety and stuff, but a drone operator, no, man, you guys are just like rebels. You fly everywhere, you don't care if you crash. Man, talk about things like racism and discrimination. I mean, this isn't that exact topic, but I think this is exactly how that attitude develops. It's like people here, you completely stereotype a whole group of people in that way. I mean, I hate to bring it up, but even here in Canada, you look at all the news, even for this year, where did all the aviation deaths came from? It came from manned aviation. I mean, that's not to say, for example, accidents won't happen and all that. You don't need some kind of guideline when people are flying it, let's just say in a dangerous way, but this is completely ludicrous. I mean, if you're based on the numbers and facts, I would say overall, there's probably way more drones that are actually up in the air every single day than a traditional manned aircraft. If you include every single, even quote, toy drone flyers, I think the safety record in terms of the numbers for the drones is probably a lot higher if you dive down into the numbers. And by the sounds of it, this organization is one trying to push for remote ID on drone operators regardless of what they're doing and how. It says, COPA further notes TCCA's consideration of remote identification technology. At this point, COPA's comments are similar to those related to the DAA above, which is the detect and avoid. It says, COPA notes particularly that TCCA is considering the introduction of this requirement over delayed coming into force. COPA believes that the technology exists now and can be made light and sufficiently low cost to be mandated now. Same point again. These are not traditional manned aircraft, and especially with how the majority of the people use it. I mean, saying, oh, just do it now, the technology's there, yeah, we know it will increase like a little weight and some cost, but that's just the reality of it. If you want to be safe, do something like that. Yeah, right. Imagine someone's flying a quote toy drone right now. It really should come down to how people are using it and all that. In my opinion, it should be the same thing regardless of what you look at in life and how they manage things, like the road. I think the road's like a perfect example. You keep things completely separate, and depending on how people use it, they are all basically regulated, so to speak, in a different way. I said it before and I still think it's true. It should come down to what you're using and how. Kid flying a toy around this tree, beyond visual line of sight, technically for a brief second, that should be fine. There's gonna be no aircraft here. I mean, you're crazy if you think a manned aircraft is gonna be like in this area. If someone's flying something really huge, drone delivery at the height and path of other aircraft, then yeah, treat it just like a regular aircraft. Be really strict, because quite frankly, it's no different than my opinion than say a car and a motorcycle in the actual highway. But again, it's completely different if it's a pedestrian or bicycle rider that's using, like, let's say, the road in a completely different manner and is separated. I think that's the issue here, because ultimately, even like with Transport Canada, it seems like they basically judge this thing based on traditional manned aviation in every aspect, and you can't do it that way. I feel it's more about developing the actual traffic management system. Just like, let's say again, like the road, there's traffic lights and all that, there's clear lane distinctions. I think there needs to be the same thing. I mean, for the airspace, it should be common sense in many ways. Like, for example, if most manned aircraft are supposed to stay, 500 feet or above, what is wrong with that? Just saying really common sense. You guys stay up there, everyone else stays down here. If you want to enter that high, like for a drone fly or some of that, then get permission. Or vice versa. If you want to come this low, then you should get some kind of permission too to come that low, like in a general area. There's probably going to be exceptions in many cases, like maybe, I don't know, the helicopter is an emergency helicopter and they have to land in an area. Or vice versa, maybe as a drone operator, they're going to have to fly super high because they're trying to find someone or something like that lost in a mountain. I mean, ultimately, it should come down more to common sense and practical traffic management systems. I mean, again, if we're basing this all on facts and science, not on hysteria and assumptions, on stereotype and stuff like that, let's look at the data. Why don't you show me how many aviation disasters there were in Canada during this year, how many deaths there were with manned aviation versus, like, say, a drone, for example. Because the concern for me is, at many times it comes to life consistency. If you are this prejudiced against these groups of people in these ways, whatever groups of people are you prejudiced against in your life? Alright, see you guys later.